I've been working on Japanese performance cars for 14 years, and about 6 years ago, I was watching a documentary about Nissan GTR testing at the Nürburgring when I heard an engineer use a word I'd never encountered: at takai. It doesn't just mean warm, it has a much more precise meaning. And when I finally understood what it really meant, it completely changed how I think about engine warm-up, driving hard, and why some performance cars last forever while others blow up at 60,000 miles. In America, we wait for the temperature gauge to hit the middle. That's it. Engine's warm. Drive however you want. But in Japan, particularly among people who actually build these engines, they track something completely different. Not just coolant temperature, not just oil temperature. They're tracking the exact moment when every critical component has reached thermal stability. Metal expands at different rates. Aluminum pistons expand faster than cast iron cylinder walls. Bearing clearances change. Oil viscosity shifts. And there's a specific point where all of these systems reach equilibrium. That's atatakai. The moment your engine is truly ready. Not just running, ready. The reason American advice stops at coolant temperature is simple. Car companies want you to think your car is ready to drive as quickly as possible. Because if they told you the truth, that you need to wait significantly longer before driving hard, you'd feel like the car was slow to wake up. That hurts the driving experience in the showroom. So they optimize for perception, not longevity. Japanese engineers, especially the ones building performance engines, don't care about your feelings. They care about preventing catastrophic failure. And they know that most engine damage happens in the first few minutes after startup, when components are expanding at different rates, and oil hasn't reached every surface yet. Here's what most people don't know. I'm about to walk you through 15 specific things that happen during engine warm-up that determine whether your engine lasts 100,000 miles or 400,000. These aren't theories. These are measurable thermal events that Japanese engineers track obsessively and that American owners completely ignore. And one of them, number 11, is so counterintuitive that it's going to make you rethink every cold start you've ever done. Hit subscribe right now, because if you care about making your engine last, this is information you won't find in any owner's manual sold in the United States. First, coolant temperature hits operating range long before oil temperature does. Your temperature gauge on the dashboard measures coolant. Most cars hit the middle of the gauge around 190 degrees Fahrenheit. That takes about 5 minutes of normal driving. But your oil temperature at that same moment is still sitting somewhere around 140 degrees. Full operating temperature for oil is usually 210 to 220 degrees. That's a 70-degree gap. Oil that's 70 degrees below operating temperature is significantly thicker. It doesn't flow into tight bearing clearances as easily. It doesn't lubricate as effectively. And if you're driving hard, asking the engine for high RPM or heavy load, you're running metal on metal in places you can't see. I pulled apart a Subaru WRX last year with only 68,000 miles. The owner said he always waited for the temp gauge to read normal before driving hard. The rod bearings were scored. The crank journals had visible wear. The engine had been oil-starved every single day, even though the dipstick showed full, and the coolant was always at temperature. Replacing that engine cost $4,500. Waiting an extra 5 minutes after the coolant gauge reads normal costs $0. Second, piston to cylinder wall clearance is still expanding unevenly in the first 10 minutes. Pistons are aluminum. Cylinder walls are usually cast iron or a steel liner. Aluminum expands roughly twice as fast as iron when heated. When the engine is cold, the clearance between the piston and the cylinder wall is larger than it should be. As things heat up, that gap closes. But it doesn't close evenly. The piston crown, the top of the piston exposed to combustion, heats up first. The skirt, the lower part that rides against the cylinder wall, heats up slower. If you're at wide open throttle while that's still happening, you get piston slap, uneven wear, and in extreme cases, piston scuffing. Japanese tuning shops that build engines for track use have a rule: no more than 50% throttle until oil temperature is at least 180 degrees. not coolant, oil. I've seen engines built by HKS and Tomei that have 300,000 miles of hard track use. They all followed that rule. I've also seen American-built track cars that followed coolant temp only. Most of them needed rebuilds before 100,000 miles. Third, your turbocharger is oil-cooled and oil-lubricated, and it spins at over 100,000 RPM. If you get on boost before the oil is fully up to temperature, you're forcing thick, cold oil through a bearing that's spinning faster than almost anything else in your car. The bearing clearances in a turbo are measured in microns. If the oil is too thick to get in there immediately, the bearing runs dry. Even for a fraction of a second, that causes damage. Do that every day for a year, and your turbo fails. I had a customer with a Nissan GT-R. He tracked oil temperature religiously. Never went into boost until oil hit 200 degrees. At 115,000 miles, we pulled the turbos for inspection. The bearings still had the factory crosshatch pattern. Zero measurable wear. A replacement set of turbos for that car is $8,000. An oil temperature gauge is $200. Fourth, your engine's bearing clearances are designed around hot oil, not cold oil. When oil is cold, it's thicker. When it's thick, it doesn't squeeze into the tiny gaps between the crankshaft and the bearing surfaces as easily. Those bearings depend on a thin film of pressurized oil to prevent metal-to-metal contact. If the oil can't form that film because it's too viscous, the crankshaft literally rides on the bearing surface. You won't hear it, you won't feel it, but it's happening. And every time it happens, you're removing microscopic layers of bearing material. I tore down a Lexus IS 350 with 90,000 miles. The owner changed oil every 5,000 miles, always used full synthetic, did everything right. Except he had a 15-minute commute and drove it hard from the moment the coolant gauge read normal. The main bearings were worn beyond spec. The oil clearances were loose enough that the engine had low oil pressure at idle. That engine needed a full rebuild. Cost was $6,500. The simple fix is to watch oil temperature, not coolant temperature, and keep RPMs below 4,000 until oil hits at least 190 degrees. Fifth, your transmission fluid is even slower to warm up than engine oil. Most people don't even think about this. Transmission fluid operates the clutches, the valve body, the torque converter. When it's cold, shifts are harsh because the fluid can't flow through the valve body quickly enough to make smooth pressure changes. More importantly, cold fluid doesn't lubricate the clutch packs effectively. If you're doing full throttle shifts while the trans fluid is still cold, you're wearing out clutches every single time. Automatic transmissions are especially sensitive to this. I've seen Lexus and Toyota transmissions with 300,000 miles that still shift perfectly because the owner let the car warm up for 10 minutes before driving, then drove gently for another 10. I've also seen the same transmission fail at 80,000 miles because the owner did back-to-back hard launches on cold fluid. A transmission rebuild is $4,000 to $7,000 depending on the model. Waiting 15 minutes is free. Sixth, engine block and cylinder head expand at different rates, and that affects head gasket sealing. The block is usually iron. The head is usually aluminum. Aluminum expands faster. During warm-up, the head is expanding while the block is still relatively cold. That creates uneven clamping force on the head gasket. The gasket is designed to handle this, but only if combustion pressures are reasonable. If you're at wide-open throttle and high boost while the block and head are still reaching thermal equilibrium, you're putting extreme pressure on a gasket that doesn't have its full clamping force yet. This is why head gasket failures are so common on Subarus that get driven hard when cold. The Boxer engine design makes this worse because the heads are horizontal and the gaskets are side-loaded. I've seen WRXs blow head gaskets at 50,000 miles. I've also seen the same engine go 200,000 miles without issue when the owner followed a strict warm-up routine. A head gasket replacement on a Subaru is $1,800 to $3,000 depending on labor rates. Seventh, Catalytic converters need to reach light-off temperature before they actually do anything. And until they do, you're dumping unburned fuel into the exhaust. Light-off temperature is the point where the catalyst starts the chemical reaction that cleans your exhaust. That's usually around 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Until the cat reaches that temperature, it's just a piece of metal that fuel passes through. If you're at wide open throttle while the cat is still cold, you're sending a lot of unburned fuel down the exhaust. That fuel can actually damage the catalyst substrate. It can also wash oil off the cylinder walls, which brings us back to bearing wear. Japanese emissions engineers design warm-up strategies that get the cat to light-off temperature as quickly as possible without putting load on the engine. That usually means high idle for the first 30 seconds, then very light throttle for the first few minutes. I've seen original catalytic converters still functioning perfectly at 250,000 miles on cars that followed this. I've also seen cats fail and need replacement at 70,000 miles on cars that were driven hard immediately after cold start. Catalytic converter replacement is $1,200 to $3,000, depending on the vehicle. Eighth, cold fuel doesn't atomize as well as warm fuel, and that creates uneven combustion. Fuel injectors spray a mist. That mist needs to vaporize before it ignites. When the intake valves, the intake manifold, and the combustion chamber are all cold, fuel doesn't vaporize as efficiently. Some of it stays liquid. Liquid fuel doesn't burn. It either washes oil off the cylinder walls or it goes out the exhaust. Either way, you're losing power and creating wear. This is especially true with direct injection engines, where fuel is sprayed directly into the combustion chamber. Until the chamber itself is hot, you're not getting complete combustion. Japanese tuners monitor air-fuel ratios during warm-up obsessively. They know that cold engines run rich, and they compensate by keeping load low until intake air temperature and coolant temperature are both stable. I've seen direct injection engines with carbon buildup on the intake valves at 40,000 miles because the owner did short trips and never let the engine get fully warm. Cleaning that carbon is a $600 service. Ninth, your engine's knock sensor is less effective when the engine is cold, and that means you're more likely to damage the engine with detonation if you're on boost early. Knock sensors detect the vibration frequency of detonation, which is uncontrolled combustion. When metal is cold, it conducts vibration differently. The knock sensor can't detect detonation as accurately when the engine block is still cold. That means your ECU might not pull timing fast enough to prevent damage. This is a massive issue on turbocharged engines, where detonation can destroy pistons in seconds. I've pulled apart engines with holes in the pistons caused by a single detonation event. The owner thought the engine was warm because the coolant gauge was normal, but the block itself was still cold. The knock sensor didn't respond fast enough, and the engine detonated under boost. That engine was a total loss. Replacement cost was $7,500. The fix is simple. No boost until oil temperature is at full operating range, and the engine has been running for at least 10 minutes. 10th, cold starts cause the majority of engine wear over the life of the vehicle, and most of that wear happens in the first 30 seconds. When you start a cold engine, there's no oil pressure yet. The pump hasn't started moving oil through the galleries. For the first few seconds, parts of the engine are running with no lubrication at all, just the residual oil that clung to the surfaces after the last shutdown. This is why remote start, if used incorrectly, can actually cause more harm than good. If you remote start the car, then immediately drive it hard because it's been idling for 5 minutes, you've done nothing to warm up the oil. It's still cold. You've just burned fuel. The Japanese approach is to start the car, let it idle for 30 to 60 seconds maximum, then drive it gently with low RPM and low load until oil temperature comes up. I've torn down engines with 400,000 miles that followed this routine. The cylinder walls still had visible crosshatch. The bearings looked new. Compare that to engines with 100,000 miles that were revved high immediately after cold start. Those engines had visible scoring on the cylinder walls and measurable bearing wear. 11th, Letting your car idle for 10 minutes to warm up is actually worse than driving it gently. This one surprises people. Idling puts almost no load on the engine. That means it takes forever for the oil to actually heat up. The engine is running, but it's not doing enough work to generate the heat needed to bring oil up to temperature quickly. You're better off idling for 60 seconds maximum, then driving at low RPM, under 3000, with minimal throttle, until the oil temperature gauge shows at least 180 degrees. This gets heat into the oil faster, which gets it flowing into bearings faster, which actually reduces wear. Japanese engineers call this active warm-up. You're using light load to generate heat intentionally. I've seen this approach cut warm-up time in half compared to idling, and the engines show less wear because they spend less time running on cold, thick oil. The mistake is confusing gentle driving with hard driving. Gentle driving at 2000 RPM in third gear is fine. Hard driving at 4000 RPM in second gear is not. 12th, your differential and axle fluids are cold too, and if you're doing hard launches or aggressive cornering before they're warm, you're wearing out gears. Everyone focuses on engine and transmission. Almost no one thinks about the differential, but it has the same problem. Cold fluid is thick. Thick fluid doesn't lubricate as well. The ring and pinion gears in your differential are under enormous load during acceleration. If the fluid isn't up to temperature, you're wearing away the surface of those gears every time you launch hard. I've seen differentials with whining noises and visible gear wear at 60,000 miles because the owner did burnouts and hard launches on cold fluid. I've also seen the same differential at 200,000 miles with zero noise because the owner waited until the entire drivetrain was warm. A differential rebuild is $2,000 to $4,000, depending on the type. 13th, your engine's variable valve timing system relies on oil pressure to function, and cold oil means the system doesn't respond correctly. Most modern engines use VVT to optimize power and efficiency. The system uses oil pressure to advance or retard cam timing. When oil is cold and thick, the VVT solenoids can't move the cam phasers as quickly or as accurately. That means your engine isn't running at the correct cam timing during warm-up. If you're asking for high power while the VVT system is still trying to catch up, you're either going to get poor performance or you're going to put stress on components that aren't in the right position yet. I've seen VVT actuators fail at 90,000 miles because they were constantly being commanded to move while oil pressure was insufficient. Replacing VVT components is $800 to $1,500 depending on the engine. 14th, cold air intake temperatures affect how your ECU calculates fuel delivery, and if you're at wide open throttle on a cold engine, you're likely running leaner than you think. The ECU uses intake air temperature as one of many inputs to determine how much fuel to inject. Cold air is denser. Denser air needs more fuel. But if the intake manifold itself is still cold, the air temperature sensor might not be reading accurately. That can lead to a lean condition, where there's not enough fuel for the amount of air coming in. Lean conditions cause high exhaust gas temperatures, which can damage valves, pistons, and turbos. I've seen exhaust valves burned on engines that were tuned perfectly on a dyno but driven hard when cold in real-world conditions. The fix is to wait until intake air temperature stabilizes, which usually takes about the same amount of time as oil temperature. 15th, the single most important thing you can do is install an oil temperature gauge if your car doesn't have one, and never go above half throttle until oil hits at least 190 degrees. Most cars have a coolant temperature gauge. Almost none have an oil temperature gauge. That's a problem, because oil temperature is the single best indicator of whether your engine is actually ready. You can buy an aftermarket oil temp gauge for $150 to $300. Installation takes about 2 hours. Once you have it, the rule is simple. Don't go hard until oil is at 190 minimum, 210 ideally. I've been following this rule on every car I own for the last 6 years. My Lexus GS has 230,000 miles. The engine runs like new. I pulled the valve cover last year to replace a gasket. There was zero sludge. The camshafts looked factory fresh. That's not luck. That's thermal management. Japanese engineers don't use the word atatakai casually. It represents a complete understanding of thermodynamics, oil flow, metal expansion, and bearing clearances. It's the moment when the engine isn't just running. It's in balance. Every component is at the temperature it was designed to operate at. Every clearance is correct. Every fluid is flowing the way it should. That's when the engine is ready to be driven hard, not when the coolant gauge hits the middle. When the oil is hot, the metal has expanded, and the system has reached equilibrium. American owners wait for the coolant gauge. Japanese owners wait for true thermal stability. One group replaces engines at 100,000 miles. The other group drives the same engine for 400,000. Same car, different understanding. If you want your engine to last, stop trusting the coolant gauge. Start tracking oil temperature. Wait for atatakai. Let me know in the comments what your current mileage is and whether your car has an oil temp gauge. I read every single one. And in the next video, I'm going to show you the specific oil change interval that Japanese Lexus owners follow that's completely different from what the dealer recommends, and why it prevents sludge that destroys engines. You're not going to want to miss it.